Join us as we are discussing induction of labour from the baby's perspective on this episode of The Midwife's Cauldron. I'm Katie James, and this is the Midwife's Cauldron podcast. Each episode, I'm joined by my incredible co-host, Dr. Rachel Reed. Listen in as we hubble, bubble, toil and trouble our way through aspects of womanhood, midwifery, birth and lactation. So go on, subscribe now, and hear us on your favourite podcast host. In this podcast, I really wanted to look at really the baby's perspective and have a look at how currently in our modern society, the induction rate seems to be increasing exponentially. We seem to have a huge amount of women, particularly in high and middle income countries, that are experiencing induction and maybe being persuaded to have inductions. And I think for me, being, more postnatally focused in terms of as a lactation consultant and midwife, I would like to have a look at what happens both to the mother, but also to the infant and the potential impact on that postnatally. And really all of this starts back at the beginning with your knowledge, Rachel, about, what's going on in the world of induction and why we're seeing more of this, what the impact is both on the mother and the infant, and then perhaps we can just have a look at what I'm seeing really and how this really plays a part and a huge role in how mothering begins and how feeding begins and whether it actually continues or not, and of what's going on with induction, what's happening in the world of induction.
Yeah, well, I think this is really important, and I've spoken about induction millions of times, and I've written about induction, and I can't get away from induction.
I'm so sorry to bring it back to you again. It's going to be a burning question, so we had to talk about it.
I know. Well, it keeps coming up, and when we asked the listeners, "What do you want us to talk about?" up it popped again. So, and this will not be the last time. But I just, I think it's really important that we look at it from this perspective, because I haven't done this before, so I'm going to learn lots in this podcast.
He's hoping.
In terms of, the impact postnatally, because when we talk to women about induction and the risks of induction, what everything tends to center on is that teeny tiny little 0.whatever% chance of perinatal mortality and morbidity. And that's the focus of all of the conversations. And nobody's kind of having the conversations about the impact of induction long term, or into the breastfeeding relationship, or any of that
Absolutely.
stuff.
I would totally agree. And there are huge impacts that we will go on and talk about. So yeah, I think this is really a mindful conversation that we need to be having about this. It's not just that one period of time. It has potential long-term effects.
And it's increasing. So every year with the student midwives, we look at the Australian national statistics, and there's a lag. So they're kind of like a couple, like we've got the 2019 statistics at the moment that are the current ones, so they're from 2017. So there's always a lag, and every year we kind of look at the key stats, and every year you watch the induction of labour stat jump by a percentage or 2 percentages. So in Australia, and this is pretty common across all the kind of well-resourced countries with strong maternity systems, the induction rate is 33% in general. But for the small group of, in Australia, follow through kind of, they call the low risk little cohort of women, and look at what happens to women with uncomplicated pregnancies, having their first baby. And for that group of women, it's 41.3%.
Wow.
So that was in 2017. So I would bet that it's probably higher now.
So you're saying low risk, uncomplicated pregnancies. We're in Australia, which is probably representative also in the UK and in the US and in a lot of the sort of high income countries. We're looking at around about a 40% induction rate currently.
That was in 2017.
And so
currently it's probably more.
And for how long have we been seeing this rate increase?
Well, every year since I've been looking at the Australian stats, so that's what, a decade.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's just, and every year we add into the mix more reasons, and we'll talk more about reasons, I guess, in relation to how the reason impacts on the
Oh,
baby.
absolutely. I mean, in
And
terms of the baby, we're seeing more inductions happen earlier. In terms of those late preterm
yeah,
infants, that is the largest growing cohort of preterm infants. And most of those have been in induced labor for whatever the complications may be.
and we're not paying attention to all the really important things that need to happen in the hours, never mind the days, before labor for the baby, to prepare the baby not only for labor, but also for that early breastfeeding behavior. Well, labor is a pretty challenging experience for babies. It's meant to be, because it's actually that kind of hypoxia, that slight hypoxia, that initiates the transitory changes that baby needs to make into breathing and establishing breathing and out, living outside of the mom. And but the mother's body's part of that transition.
Absolutely.
So before labor happens, there's lots of changes that we talk about that happen to the woman's body in terms of her cervix, blah blah blah. But the baby respiratory systems getting ready, clearing the fluid out of the way, gastrointestinal systems ramping up, ready to do that first poo, often done inside the mom, at the end of labor. The immune system's getting ready to function. And importantly, there's changes in the baby's brain that prepare the baby for that hypoxia that happens in labor. So the baby's set up ready for the kind of challenges that labor is going to bring.
We're well clever.
So all of that's happening.
We're quite well designed, really, as mammals. We've been doing it a long time. It's not really surprising that we're prepared for this.
No, and there's quite a lot of us, so it's obviously working fairly well.
We seem to be overpopulating, so yeah.
So the baby actually tells the mom. So once it's kind of making those changes, it actually sends a little precursor of estrogen to the placenta.
Hello,
so
I'm ready.
It produces cortisol and it's adrenal, and goes, Mom, send me out. I'm ready.
I'm ready to pop.
And that initiates all the kind of changes in the woman's body that start up labor. So that's everything, including her inner neurological changes, so she can adapt to pain better, sets up the oxytocin receptors that you'll know all about in the uterus and in her brain and breasts, and everything's kind of getting set up, not just for labor, but for afterwards. And then kind of off labor goes. And for the baby, labor.
Just a short pause here to say apologies for the poor internet connection, which this episode has unfortunately a little bit of the way through it. It commenced quite early on, and this is what happens. This is going to be interesting listening, which is just bang, stop. Sorry, setting the baby up.
Where did I get up to?
Oh, fuck, this is the problem. When I'm banging you, I forget where you've got up to. Setting up the baby for the labor phase. But luckily, eventually, we do get ourselves back on track. Sometimes not quite to the right point, hence for the interlude here, because we've had a little bit of a laugh and a few bangs along the way. But please bear with us and keep listening. Enjoy the rest of the Induction and All About Babies episode. Can you bring in how we used to think that it was because of the baby's sort of the size of humans that our bodies would expel the baby, would get us ready for birth? Because that's been a big anthropological thing, was as infant, as human beings, we can only grow so big. And, if we grew any bigger, we wouldn't actually fit through the pelvis at all. But we know that it's to do with the fact that the baby is ready and sends off those signals. But it had always been said that humans have massive heads, so they cannot get out of the pelvis. And I know we have massive heads, and I know that we are born more immature. But it isn't a case of, your head's well massive, like, and I've got to get you out of my fanny, so I'm going to give birth. It's not that. It's the baby sending these signals that it's ready to... for pregnancy, for labor to initiate. Am I wrong?
Yeah, it's not. No, you're right, Pet. You're right. It's not about the size of the baby, which is why babies are all kinds of different sizes. but that goes right back to that her story stuff around the idea that it's a machine and it's mechanical, and once the baby's head gets and body gets to a certain size, the woman's machine pump uterus goes get out and kind of does the
I've got images
pushing,
of going back to
out.
one of my favorite films, which many people will disagree with, but it's Wizard of Oz 2. I don't think it's called that. I think it's called Return to Oz. And there's the Tin Man and they have to wind him up. And I feel like you would just wind up with this big clockwork key at the back of a woman's back, and it'd be like, get the oil in and pop the baby out. This just looks like mechanical. Actually sounds like a brilliant invention. It sounds so much easier. Hey, she's ready, man. Just turn the key, get the WD-40 in, unrust her, turn the key, out pops a baby. Ta-da! Brilliant. I've solved all the problems.
Well, you shouldn't laugh.
Oh,
you shouldn't laugh, because there was all kinds of inventions like that. There was an invention for centrifugal force. It was patented. I've got the picture of a woman seriously strapped on a contraption that would like spin her. Like, you know, when you go on roundabouts when you're a kid and you get like spun and you nearly fall. Yeah, there's like a contraption that somebody had patented, the centrifugal force to get the baby out.
Did they ever use it?
No.
Oh my God, have you got a picture of that? Can we put it on the Insta?
I don't know whether I've got a copyright agreement. I'll see if I can find it, if I can find a link to it.
That's hideous. And was that back in like 1850s type or early 1900s?
No, I think that was in the early
like real industrial, like when everyone's in the workhouse.
Yeah.
Wowzers. Yeah. That's hideous. Okay, I'm going to take back my idea of the clockwork pregnancy. I don't think I'm going to get past any ethical.
I don't know. It might actually if you look at what's coming out nowadays, you might well actually.
Well, maybe we're comparing it to Induction. It might be more pleasant. So who knows? Let us know if you have any desire to try out Katie's clockwork induction method, and a bit of WD-40, a key in your back, and turn and pop, out comes the baby. Ta-da!
We're probably not that far away from that, Katie. We won't be laughing in 10 years' time.
Jesus.
Anyway, do you want to know how the baby actually comes out?
Yeah, Ari, tell us, pet.
Right. So the baby's told them start labour. So during labour, in the kind of established labour, there's not a lot of kind of stresses on a baby during a physiological birth, particularly in early labour. And babies you can see babies sleep. If you're monitoring babies with the CTG, which you shouldn't be doing if it's a normal physiological birth, but you'll see babies have like sleep patterns. So every time there's a contraction, it squeezes the placenta and baby. So it reduces the blood flow through the placenta. I always imagine like a sponge. It's like kind of squeezes. The sponge can't reperfuse until you relax, and then the sponge fills back with water. So it's that kind of thing happening at the placental bed. And a healthy full-term baby who's made all those adaptations ready for labour just manages that really well. And then you get to the kind of pushing phase of labour where contractions change and become more of because the fundus has been pulled right up to the top. So it's made this big kind of thick layer of muscle at the top of the uterus, which then starts to push the baby down. And at that point, the baby starts to move through the vagina and get head compression. So that's when you see the heart rate dip because their vagal nerve's getting squished, and then it comes back up. And that starts that kind of mild hypoxia for the baby that is getting it ready to, okay, you're getting your head squeezed, you're going to come out, you're going to have to do something, you're going to have to breathe.
And if you are monitoring a CTG, this is often when fear can come in, because we're seeing those regular decelerations of that heart rate, but actually this is a normal physiological response.
Yeah, and then everyone freaks out and pulls the baby out when that's the baby's adapting. The baby is adapting to what's happening. So, and then of course, you've got crowning, and then what you'll see if you're monitoring the heart rate is you'll see a real dip in the heart rate because there's a compression over the baby's skull for a prolonged period of time as the baby's head's crowning and being born. So that's the experience of birth, physiological birth for the baby, which is completely different in induced labour, because you've got contractions that are not being regulated by the interaction of mother and baby. So you've got the potential for much stronger contractions with less relaxing of the uterus in between, so less ability for the placental sponge, if you like, to refill. in between contractions, and particularly at the end of labor, when usually women's spontaneous contractions slow down to give the baby that little bit of more rest as its head's getting squashed and it's becoming a little bit hypoxic. You don't get that. You just get the same pattern of contractions. So you often, the most common risk in induction is fetal distress because of the difference in the labor. And you've also taken away the membranes around the baby in the bag of fluids, so that the compression of the baby and the cord and everything's just that little bit more. So it's not uncommon for babies to get distressed during labor.
It doesn't sound quite as comfortable as the beautiful sponge analogy, that's for sure. And yeah, you're right.
So I guess what I'm saying
I've completely forgotten about the bag of waters of being this lovely balloon. I don't know why that had gone from my head, but of course it's that, you know, you're just being squished around in this lovely bag of waters if they've remained intact until, you know, towards the end, which often they do in a physiological birth. But we've broken those right at the very beginning.
Yeah, and it's like I always think of that as the analogy of, you know, when you've got you've got a water balloon. If you've got like a ping pong ball in a water balloon,
sounds
you're
nice.
trying to squish the ping pong ball. You kind of can't because your pressure is you know is radiating through the water rather than going directly onto the ping pong ball. I'm really crap at analogies, but I do like them. That's how I think. I think in pictures.
So do I. I like that. I'm just imagining squishing that right now because it feels like a nice stress reliever. Not that I'm stressed with you, Rachel, at all, but it's just, that would be lush. But yeah, it's swimming around, it's getting some contractions, it's warming itself up, and then it's got all of these mechanisms ready, prepared. And then towards the end, when those contractions and that labor really gets going, then the waters will naturally break themselves. This is what we tend to see most in physiological birth, but that's the complete opposite of how we start off with an induction. An induction starts with breaking that bag of waters. So we've lost that protective, squidge.
Yeah, that's a technical word. You've lost a protective squidge around the baby.
Yeah, that's how I like to talk. Yep. Fully on it. That's me.
But no, you're right. And it's some babies will actually, break their own squidge before they start labor.
Yes.
10% of women will release their squidge before. So they labor without. So they labor without that. But at the same time, if it's a physiological birth, you've got more chance that the woman's body will actually moderate and regulate what's happening with her baby. Like when we think of labor as just the mechanical, woman pushing the baby out, we forget that there's actually this real interplay between mother and baby and their physiology and communication between the two and what's going on in the room and all this other stuff that influences the pattern of a physiological birth. But with an induced birth, the only thing that's really influencing it is, how we're turning up the syntocinon to get 3 to 4 contractions and then just keeping it going.
And the other thing, if I can mention here, is that when women are having an induced birth, they're much more likely to require pain relief. So more likely to have opioids and epidurals.
Absolutely, because it feels different. If you talk to any women who have experienced physiological birth and induced contractions, and we're talking about syntocinon induced, some women are lucky enough to have prostaglandin and then go off into labor. But a lot of, if you need syntocinon, the contractions that are produced through that feel different. They're not the same. So although the molecule that's causing the contraction is the same, if you looked at it, the oxytocin is exactly the same as pitocin or syntocinon, depending on where you live as to what the artificial version is called. The action is very different. And a lot of women choose to have an epidural before the induction even starts. And, I used to offer that to women who I cared for.
Me too.
In a hospital setting is, to talk about that, have you thought about pain relief? Because if you'd planned to have a water birth and no pain relief, this is now going to be a totally different story. And it's absolutely fine for you to reevaluate that and decide. Because if you think about the risks of an epidural, which are, it slows down birth. Well, that's not going to happen because you've got an induced birth. So it's not going to slow down the oxytocin because you're putting it in there.
Exactly.
So really the only thing I guess to be mindful of is that it also relaxes the pelvic floor to a certain extent, which makes the baby less able to rotate and pivot on that kind of muscle floor to get into a good position. So you might need a little bit more help to shift positions, move positions, shift your pelvis, and all that kind of thing if you've got an epidural going.
Have we got good, is there some good research that just looks at, the percentage of women who are more likely to have a assisted birth or a cesarean birth if they've had an induced labor?
Well, you can get research to tell you anything you want it to tell you in the induction space. It does my head in because no research is objective, and often you'll get the headlines, that it reduces the chance of cesarean. But then when you need to actually look at how the research was done and how it's interpreted.
The confounding factors as well.
Right, exactly. And for women having their first babies, most of the research shows it increases their chance of having a cesarean. It doesn't increase the chance of women having their second, third, whatever babies. So when you put them all into a big pool and mix them up, it looks like it doesn't have an influence, but when you separate the women having their first baby, it does. Although there is some research showing that it doesn't increase the chance of first-time mothers having a cesarean, but that research is done in hospital settings where there's a lot of intervention anyway. And what that tells me is that they're very good at doing induction.
In what way do you mean good at doing it? Like they're on the ball, they look for signs, or they're really used to it, so they do lots of them, and therefore they're doing lots of cesareans anyway, so their rate hasn't particularly increased because they're more of a medicalized hospital?
So what you sometimes see is when you've got research that's putting women into induction or not induction groups, all right? And if it's happening in a setting where people are really familiar with induction and that's normal and part of their day-to-day business, you get really good at induction. I've worked in a hospital where we did lots of inductions, and you get pretty good at managing the syntocin on infusion, managing, you're basically managing the labor, and you get good at that. And if you're not also working with physiological birth, and all of a sudden you've got a study where you're looking after this woman who's not been induced and might be post-dates more than you're used to seeing, there'll be anxiety and fear around that. So you'll be more likely to intervene than when you've got nice control over the woman, and you can your thresholds of doing things is probably going to be lower because you're doing it all anyway. Whereas a woman who's having a physiological birth, like we were saying about the head compressions, you might freak out a bit more once she starts pushing, you're seeing decelerations because, oh my God, I'm not in control of this, because she's not being induced and she hasn't got the epidural, versus this woman's got an epidural, she's being induced, I'm in control of this situation. So
this is my comfortable spot. It's like anything. It's where you work is, I'm comfortable in this sphere of my knowledge, so therefore I can do a, in quotes, good job. And the fear comes from the other, so to speak.
And it comes from what you're used to doing. And that's why, the research around placentas is that, in a setting where you've got care providers who are comfortable with physiology and supporting physiological birth of the placenta, if they start actively managing it with, medication, they increase the chance that you're going to hemorrhage. So, and a lot of research, and this is a problem with birth research, there's so many factors, relationships, environment that influence the outcome. That they think they're doing this nice clean objective, just measuring numbers from this to this, but it's so much more complex than that.
And similar in the breastfeeding world as well, because you've got so many, likewise, same complex factors that you come into the mix: psychological, social, environment, whether how the staff are trained, what's normal for them, the type of births that unit is having. And where the research is being done. So absolutely, it's really complex and it's difficult to extrapolate information. So we have to take this sort of generalized look at what's going on.
Which often then isn't helpful when we're trying to talk about individuals and individual situations. And if we're talking about physiology and we're not comparing it, how can you compare? Often you're comparing interventions to birth that has also got interventions, just not that intervention. So it's just really complex. I'm sure it's the same with babies. So Katie, tell me what babies do once they're out.
Ideally, they've had a lovely physiological time with a nice sponge in their squidge of water and they've prepared themselves. And what we tend to see with most babies is just this normal baby comes out, baby's placed on the mother's chest, is dried. The baby will follow these natural instincts and this pathway. And so the baby will search and look for the breast. And that can be within minutes or it can be within that first hour generally. And we generally see that they've already got themselves to the breast and they are breastfeeding well within that first hour. And so what we start to see is that they make these tiny movements. So, when we check babies and we hold them up, and I always, say to mums, or I used to say to mums, families at antenatal classes, like the doctor or the midwife will do the baby check afterwards and they'll hold your baby up and you'll see the baby stepping. Like we don't do that for fun just to go, look, they're almost walking. Isn't this funny? Or we put them on their front and we see that they can crawl. It's not for fun. It's there for a reason. So we can actually put this baby quite low on a chest, which you will have seen a million times as well. And the baby will actually use the strength of both their arms, their head and their neck, and also their legs to enable them to crawl up the breast and find their way to the nipple and the breast. And, for a moment, they will have this rest period where mum and baby are a bit like, whew, that was bloody hard work. Let's just have a little bit of a rest. And, if you've used up all of this energy coming out, like labor's kind of hard work, you're going to be a bit hungry afterwards. I know if I've been on a big expedition, like I'm off to the North Pole, but I'm definitely going to want some kind of food to eat. And these babies have been fed 24/7. So naturally, they're designed to come out and seek the breast very soon. Their senses are much more heightened and alert, and this spike in oxytocin is much higher for both the mother and the baby at this point in time. And so what we see is the baby looks for the breast, and they will seek it and find it. And they actually will sort of bring their hand out to try and grab hold of the nipple. And often you see that the babies are trying to grab hold of the nipple and then they try and bring it back to their mouth. And then it's almost like they go, it's not come with it. I'm going to have to go and find it myself. So they're enabled, like, babies at minutes old are able to actually lift their heads back and rotate their head from side to side. So we see babies and we think of human infants as being really, kind of pathetic and we can't do anything. And it's all the other mammals in the mammalian kingdom that can seek and search and find the mother's nipple or teat. Human babies are designed to do this. So they will actually find their way. They will bob their head. They will move their head from side to side. Sometimes we see mums who are semi-reclined and the baby literally takes almost like this giant leap onto the breast. And this is a really, it's often called the golden hour. This is such an important time. Like the mum and the baby have this distinct smell. The baby has a heightened sense of smell and so does the mother. The colostrum has also got this wonderful taste, this smell, and is leading.
And Katie, is it true that this is what I was reading just for part of my writings, that the smell of the colostrum and the smell of the mother's breast, like the Montgomery's tubercles,
yes,
is that
Montgomery's
what they're called?
Tubercles, such a great word.
Yes.
It releases a sebum.
Right, yeah, and that smells like the amniotic fluid.
Actually, colostrum in its makeup is closer to amniotic fluid than it is to mature milk. So,
really?
Yeah, the taste and the smell. So basically what's really important, and what I would like to do, is that when we dry babies, we leave their hands still wet because they will be sucking on their fingers. And that taste is very similar to the colostrum. The Montgomery's tubercles release a sebum, and we believe that is antibacterial and a moisturizer, and also may release a type of smell as well. But the colostrum is definitely closer to amniotic fluid in terms of it has this huge amount of epidermal growth hormone in it as well, which really matures the gut. So over the last trimester, the infant's actually been swallowing its amniotic fluid and processing it. And it's a lovely thing that we do. Weeing out and drinking the same fluid. Delicious. I know actually that, placenta is quite good and does filter out. But what I always think is so awesome is in that third trimester, the infant is swallowing about 750 mils per day. How much milk
Wow.
does the infant need to be drinking by about week 2? About 750 mils per day. And from the end of the first month until 6 months, infants drink around about 750, 800 mils roughly every single day.
So they're practicing.
They're practicing. So their body is allowing them to learn, to enable them to absorb this amount of fluid and process it. Obviously, what happens at the beginning is they come out and they have an excess fluid on board. And so we have these tiny amounts of colostrum. And so these infants are designed to find and seek the breast within this first hour. And they have this wonderful breastfeed. And if you've ever witnessed this, you'll often hear, or we believe we can hear. It's very difficult to actually know this is happening because we don't want to interrupt this birth, and we don't really want to stick an ultrasound probe and then weigh and test weigh the baby just after birth, because this is a time when we really should be hands off and leave this mother and infant. And the last thing I want to do is go in as a midwife with gloved hands, and that smell of that sort of blue, whatever, nitrile glove. I just want to get it away and keep it away. This is the moment for the mum. If that baby is well and doesn't need to be interfered with, then this moment needs to be quiet still. That's why we need to give mothers information about this process before she's given birth, ideally, so that she knows that we are still there. We're with her. We've checked the baby. We're observing. We're checking everything's okay.
But we're out of the way.
But we're out of the way. And we're not interrupting this magical moment. The problem comes when this doesn't happen.
I call those moments after birth enchantment.
Oh.
So from the perspective of what's happening and what we need to support, and I guess I'm not necessarily just coming from the breastfeeding perspective, but from the perspective of this placenta needs to come out. So what needs to happen is that this enchantment process needs to happen. The mother and baby need to fall in love, release all that oxytocin, do all that, baby crawl that you were describing.
But it's not
and
just
that,
the baby crawl,
touching the nipple.
breast massage that's happening with their hands as well. And that's what we're not seeing when they've had intervention, whether that is from the huge amount of, fake oxytocin, or whether that is because if you are induced, you're more likely to have an epidural. And then we kind of see in the research that with epidurals, they're less likely to induce these behaviors. Also with opiates, again, there's so many compounding factors. When we look at the studies overall, there isn't huge defining studies stating definitely when they've had an epidural, or definitely when they've had induction, it's the oxytocin that has caused the baby to behave like this. But what we are generally seeing is that there is a different behavior mechanism when a baby has had an intervention or a non-physiological birth. And so that absolutely is going to impact not only on the breastfeeding, but in terms of getting this placenta out, helping this mother's uterus contract. And it's that kicking motion, that crawl, but those movements of breast massage, which the baby actually continues to do during the feeding as well. So it's not just the suckling. We believe it's actually the hands. I'm making motions with my hands because I can't speak. What am I doing? I'm doing like boxing.
You're doing little. This looks like it. I was going to say, you look like a roux having a boxing match.
It's a bit more gentle, but yeah, it's more massage.
And it's interesting because back in the day, we used to swaddle babies and tie their little hands down so they couldn't get in the way when they were feeding. So that as a midwife, you'd get. I mean, I had this done to me with my baby in hospital. As a midwife, you'd make a package out of the baby, and then you'd get the back of the baby's head and the woman's nipple, and you'd kind of fit the two together.
Yep.
So you were actually interfering with all of that.
And you try and connect them as if it's like a piece of Velcro, like get the baby on the nipple. I mean, we still see that in some areas. Definitely, it's not happening in all hospitals, but it's definitely not happening in terms of skin to skin. Is not basically. If we look at the World Health Organization, and UNICEF, we have this huge drive to keep this first hour uninterrupted. We are still interrupting this first enchantment hour. I love that. In many other countries, and that may be more middle and low income countries. And definitely in these more high income countries, we have more knowledge in terms of we are keeping that first hour sacred for most births. But it is not a practice which is happening everywhere all the time at this point in time, which is deeply sad. And it's something that is so simple because physiologically it stabilizes the baby. It actually releases and reduces that cortisol stress hormone. It brings up this oxytocin hormone. And for the mother, that's not only calming and inducing this love, this enchantment, this actual just falling in love with her baby. It helps contract the uterus, but it helps contract those milk-making cells, that alveolus where the milk is stored, where the colostrum is at that point, and it pushes it down to the infant. So these are essential practices that are happening. If we wrap them up like a little burrito, they literally have no concept of the space, the area. What are they smelling? The washing fabric on the the new hat that's been put on them, or the hospital gown, or the blanket. This is really confusing to babies. They need to be able to smell their mum. They need to be able to smell the amniotic fluid, all this stuff that we sort of think is a bit funky and a bit like, oh God, I'm sweaty. And this is great. We don't want to wash you or your baby in those early hours. Like, yes, you probably feel sweaty and disgusting, but your baby's like, whoa, you are lush. This is like the best thing ever. I've not even seen your face. Now I get to look at your face, and you're beautiful, and you smell beautiful, and you taste amazing. And it's this whole falling in love. Like, this baby has been waiting all this time to look at your face. And we often think that babies don't really communicate, or they don't do much until maybe they're 5-6 weeks old. This is absolute rubbish. Babies will, if they're being held by the partner or by the midwife within even a few minutes of birth, if they hear their mum's voice, they will try and turn their head. It's slow, but they will turn their head towards their mum. They recognize the family member or the mum's partner. They recognize their voice, and they will turn their head towards that voice as well. Babies will actually mimic within minutes if they've had a physiological birth. So if you got a mom who's maybe having a nice big smiley expression, or she pokes her tongue out, you will see the baby try and open their mouth in response, or try and point the tip of their tongue out. It takes several seconds, but we're seeing this from the moment after birth. We are not completely just pathetic blobs as humans. We can achieve quite a lot.
No, and I think, on the sharing that information with women antenatally, I've got a lovely story that a mum that I was looking after, who's having a home birth, first baby, and just did not want to breastfeed. We discussed it. It was not something she wanted to do. So she had a formula feed ready. I was going to support her with that. And I would talk to her about just this stuff we're talking about. This is how the baby comes out and what the baby wants to do. And she's like, oh yeah, I'll let the baby latch on for the first time. So I'll let it do that in the first hour, because I'm really interested in to see the baby do this thing that you say the baby's going to do.
Yeah.
And she had these really big breasts, and she said, there's no way this baby's going to find my breasts, because they're kind of, swing off to the side when I'm reclined. And I went, no, you will, you'll find the breast. Anyway, the birth, the baby did what babies kind of evolved to do, and he took him a while, because he had to kind of bob his head and almost go upside down to find where the nipple was. And he attached, and she was just like, oh my God, I can't believe he did that, because she didn't help him, he just did it. And that woman was still breastfeeding 18 months later when she rang me up for her next baby.
Yep. And that is so, that's given me tingles.
He had enchanted her.
Complete enchantment. And that's why it's so important. It's not just a first hour thing. And I think what's important to also say is, if this doesn't happen, it's not too late. There are other moments and opportunities for this.
So how does induction, or particularly artificial oxytocin, alter that first hour afterwards? I know that there's research around babies' bonding behaviors are changed, so that the baby might not initiate those behaviors in the same way or as quickly. Does it also alter kind of the mother's physiology for breastfeeding?
What we have to think about is, so basically what's happening when you look at pregnancy is, we're not only growing and preparing a baby, the breasts themselves are developing under the influence of those hormones of pregnancy. So we're having this preparation, this proliferation of these milk making cells in readiness for this baby to be born. And then what happens is, really what's designed to happen is, we're talking about this enchantment hour and the baby feeding. But what happens every time that baby suckles is it's actually releasing a surge of the hormone prolactin as well. So I like to think of the two hormones that are really responsible for breastfeeding as oxytocin and prolactin. Prolactin, I like to think of as the chef, because she makes the milk, kind of, and oxytocin as the waitress, because she delivers the milk. It's my simple way of thinking. But what's really important in the beginning is that we're having frequent suckling at the breast, because basically within those first few hours and days, the breast needs to be switched on and activated. So it's the milk making cells need to be activated and switched on, so that they are basically the prolactin hormone that's swimming around. And if there's lots of it, because the baby is stimulating these huge surges in prolactin, it means there's a lot of prolactin hormone swimming around the blood system. That means
there's lots of chefs.
There's tons of chefs. They're all looking for a job. And there's loads of
in the kitchen.
Milk cells. There's loads of kitchens ready and waiting for the chef to get its job. Wow, is this going to make any sense? But so basically, every time the baby's feeding, you get these surges in prolactin. The prolactin needs to connect with the milk-making cell. Then, if you've got the kitchen and you've got the chef, milk can be made. What happens is, we believe, is after several days, roughly, we think in theory around about 3 days. We've seen this more in animal models than human. But we believe that around about 72 hours, what happens is, if we haven't had this prolactin connect with the milk-making cells, then the cell actually shuts down and it's unable to then produce food, because there's no chef there. So we need the prolactin to connect with the milk-making cells. And this is long-term. And basically those cells will shut down until she gets pregnant again, gives birth, has another opportunity for the prolactin to connect with the prolactin receptors on the milk-making cells.
So what you're saying is that this is a really, really important time. If we get this first hour or so right, then that sets up the breastfeeding relationship, and lots of chefs in the kitchen, and lots of...
The first hour, the first 3 hours, and the first 3 days. And then really it's the first, I kind of like to say 3 weeks, but it's 2 to 4. But it would just be so good if it's 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks. It would be easy to remember. But the first hours are absolutely incredibly important for making enough milk, both now and in the future. Because what we see is, if we have a mother whose baby is unable to breastfeed in that first hour or first 3 hours, and the breasts are then not activated through other mechanisms to remove milk, and that would ideally be pumping and hand expression, because you want vacuum, not just compression from hand expression, and that's been shown in the research, is that we are potentially setting this mother up for failure before she's even started.
So how does that relate to all these preterm? Because there's lots of babies now being induced at kind of even up to 37 weeks for some reasons, because there's all kinds of reasons for inducing babies, and the gestation is getting lower. And, you know, people would argue, but they're at full term once they're past 37 weeks. So is there issue if these babies aren't doing the changes prior to birth? Is the mother's body getting to prepare the breasts ready for breastfeeding, or are they already stepping off on it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So obviously we have about 8 to 10% in the high to middle income countries of preterm birth. Predominantly those are late preterm infants. There's several complex issues, and we'll need to talk about those almost in a separate podcast. But these are the infants that actually, when we look at the statistics for breastfeeding or receiving breast milk, these late preterm infants, or now we class the infants between 37 and or just before 39 weeks as early term. We're now seeing research come out to show that these infants are also less likely to breastfeed for longer. their mothers are less likely to get off to a good start in terms of good, effective, efficient, and frequent breastfeeding. And this is the problem, is that these infants can come out and perhaps they're over 2.5 kilos and they're put on the maternity ward. But these are the infants that might start off having the occasional feed, but they're not very efficient at it. And so what's happening is they're sent home at the same time, late pretermers put on the maternity ward. They're treated the same as the healthy term infant who's attaching well or learning to attach well, is taking milk from the breast and transitioning it into their stomach. What we find with these infants who've had induction or have had epidurals or are late pretermers, they're less likely to be as vigorous. They're less likely to stay as long at the breast. They're less likely to be transferring milk. And so what that means is that this mum is not getting efficient surges of prolactin. She's not activating her milk-making cells, and potentially she's shutting down the milk-making cells or the ability to make enough milk before she's even started, really. These infants are also the ones who, you wrap them up and you put them in, you wrap them up like a burrito. You put them in a plastic box that we call a bassinet.
The fish tank.
The fish tank. And these infants are really not good at feeding cues. These are the infants that might just give a little wave or might make some movements with their mouth or their tongue. And then if no one pays any attention to them, they're like, okay, I'll just go back to sleep. They're sleepy infants. These are the infants that need to be maintained in skin-to-skin contact.
They're good babies.
They're very good babies. And,
they sleep well.
They sleep well. They're classed as good babies. And this is a major problem. A wonderful lactation consultant, I've worked with several who have really influenced my career across the way, said to me, if you keep the baby in the kitchen, it will feed, and the kitchen is skin-to-skin contact. Now, I hear many midwives say, but mums are so busy and they're on their phones and they're not paying attention anymore to their babies. It doesn't matter. If you put a baby in skin-to-skin contact with its mother and snuggle them up and she's awake and she's on her phone or she's got visitors, if that baby starts to move, she will put down her phone, she will take her attention away from anybody, and she responds to her baby immediately. It doesn't matter because that bonding is happening, that oxytocin, that connection is there.
This just goes back to the mistrust of women, doesn't it? That, that the woman is the danger, that, the woman is the danger for her baby, not that actually the mother's the protection for the baby.
Totally. And we see that in terms of, policies that say the mother can't walk around with her holding her baby. She has to have it in the bassinet in some hospitals. Like the last person to drop their baby is the mother. Like that mother I like to think of elephants. Like if you've got a mother elephant and her baby, there is no way you are going near. If you're on a safari, they are not stopping anywhere close to that elephant because she has incredible amounts of this prolactin hormone, which is the mothering protection hormone surging through her. It's an incredible protective element. And when we take human babies away from human mothers, we don't react in the same way. We come from the primate family. Where do monkeys keep their babies? Do they make a little nest for them and leave them there and expect them to sleep for 4 hours? No. I'm really sorry to tell everybody, but we do come from the ape and the primate family. We have evolved. We have not evolved that much. If we look at other mammals in the kingdom, like tigers and foxes, who they are a different classification of mammals. They have a different fat content in their milk, which allows them to have many infants, to suckle them, and then possibly go out hunting for 4 to 8 hours because they have different components and levels in the milk, which enable that. We have incredibly low fat milk. Our babies need to be on us. We have immature babies. They need us to do almost everything for them, but they can find and seek the breast. They're meant to be feeding frequently because every time they feed, they surge this prolactin. They lay down the foundations to make milk for the future. Basically, they're switching the factory on. And if they don't do that, we have a problem. Now, of course, in the beginning, they're getting these small amounts of colostrum, but really, colostrum is like the baby's first immunization. It's jam-packed full of immunoglobulins. It's priming their gut. It's full of things called human milk oligosaccharides, which are these prebiotics that feed the probiotics, the good bacteria. The colostrum is helping the tight junctions in the cells to close, which means that the lactose is maintained within the lumen of the alveolus, which means that that's how your milk comes in and your milk volumes increase. So there's this whole process that has to happen. And if we are interfering with that in terms of bringing babies into the world through induction, through early planned cesareans, not on its due date, not allowing it physiologically or spontaneously to go into natural labor, we see a problem in how they react. And then the problem becomes, does this impact the mother? Can these women with preterm infants achieve a full milk supply? Yes, absolutely. But it's about the management. The baby may not be able to do this. The baby may not feed really well for 12 to 48 hours. That means that we need to be thinking about mimicking what the baby would be doing.
So this is like birth. And I think this is where we really need to think about intervention as an intervention that might require other interventions. And that's okay. That, physiology is physiology, and the best way to manage physiology is to not manage it and to keep it out of the way and support and promote an environment for physiology. But once you start intervening, you are going to have to do other interventions. If you're inducing a labor, you might stress the baby out. So you're going to need to do a CTG monitor to assess the baby. If you've had an induction and you've had a baby who's 38 weeks, who probably wouldn't have come out until it was 40 weeks or 41 weeks, you're going to have to enact an intervention to get physiology back on the track again in terms of breastfeeding.
Absolutely. Exactly that. And that's the thing, is we think of this breastfeeding as has to be natural. And, this poor mom, she's gone through this difficult delivery and birth and labor. Then we expect this baby to feed normally. It's probably not. And to be honest, as a lactation consultant, as a midwife, if there is a mother who's come on the ward having had a cesarean, a mother who's come on the ward having had an epidural, an induction, a traumatic birth, a baby who is late preterm, a baby who is early term, so up until 38 plus 5, that's when I've got alarm bells. I want to pay more attention to this mother and infant. I want to keep these two together in skin-to-skin contact as much as possible. And I want to be really alert to the fact that I'm probably going to need to use intervention for this dyad. I'm probably going to have to start this mum pumping and hand expressing early and frequent. And this is an intervention. It's a tool. It's a tool so that in 4 days, she's Dolly Parton and she's got tons of milk. Not in 4 days we go, your baby's got Tango orange, full of jaundice, and has lost 12.7% of its birth weight. And actually when we do some expression, you're getting 1.5 mils. If the baby doesn't breastfeed in the first hour, if the mother's not given support in the first 3 hours to express, these women are at much greater risk of low milk volumes at 4 weeks. And the volumes they have at 4 weeks is the volume they are likely to keep for the next 5 months if they exclusively breastfeed. I have many magic tools as a lactation consultant, well, some, but I don't have the power after around 2 to 4 weeks to magically make this mum double her milk supply if we have not intervened early on in the first 3 hours or the first 3 days. So we should see that milk comes in, or basically secretory activation, an increase in milk volume occurs at or before 72 hours. Those women who have a delayed onset of secretory activation are at much greater risk of low milk supply at 4 weeks. We see that in around 40% of the population likely to have a delay in when the milk comes in. So we think about nearly half of all the women we're seeing on the postnatal ward are likely to need some extra support. And whether that's just making sure that that infant and mother are aware of how important skin-to-skin contact is, making sure that that mother and infant She's looking for those early feeding cues. She's given support to check that that baby is transferring milk. You know, what are the wet nappies? What are the pooey nappies? Can we see or hear any swallows? This is also a tricky area and something that I think we will need to discuss in terms of test weighing and some research and preterm infants. And this gets very tricky subject because what
Another
happened
podcast.
is another podcast. There's a lot of bad history and fear around this. But basically, we need to be seeing, is this baby sucking well? Is this baby likely to be stimulating that prolactin? Is this baby switching on those milk cells? And if not, we need to do an intervention, which is expression, which is bloody awful because she's knackered. And the last thing I want to make a mum do is do more work. But also, as a lactation consultant, I see these women at 4 weeks and 6 weeks who do not have enough milk supply. And the biggest reason women stop breastfeeding in the first month is one, sore nipples. And the second biggest reason is perceived low milk supply or real low milk supply. And the more intervention we have, the more we're seeing this. So in terms of your question earlier, which I've sort of rambled around, you know, does it affect the breast? What we see from the research is that if the right intervention is given early and frequently, so if the baby is unable to breastfeed well or at all, they are encouraged to mimic the baby. They express early and frequently, so 8 times or more in 24 hours. These women can achieve the same milk volumes at 4 weeks and 2 weeks down the track that a full-term healthy infant can breastfeed. So it's about the right intervention at the right time.
Yeah, and it's about thinking about expressing as an intervention for the mother's milk supply, not just for the baby's food. Because I think a lot of time people think, oh, I'm expressing breast milk to feed the baby, when actually what you're saying is that it's to activate the breast milk production.
Completely. And this is what goes through my head. It's like, oh my God. I mean, I've described it, and anyone who's heard me speak will always know that I say it's a bit like, I think of it like CPR. So you know that we always, if you have someone who collapses in the street and they need CPR, and there's people that hang back and go, oh, I don't know what to do. Do I do breathing or do I do chest compressions? And how many do I do? I haven't been on a course. And whenever you go on those courses, they say, just do something. Just pump that heart. You're more likely for that person to survive if you just do something. You might crack a rib and you might not do some great things, but they're more likely to survive. Basically, for me, it's do something. Don't just think of the baby, think of the breasts, think of the milk cells. They need to be switched on. They need to be activated, because if they're not, we're going to end up with this mother not achieving volumes of milk that she can sustain an infant on. And she will then have to mix feed. And we know that when mothers mix feed, it's bloody hard work to be doing breastfeeding, expressing, and formula feeding, or breastfeeding and formula feeding. And the more you formula feed, the less the baby goes on the breast. The less the baby goes on the breast, the less milk you make. Vicious cycle, she ends up formula feeding. The biggest problem for me with that is that in our current society, what's happening with that is the mother takes on board that as guilt, as her problem, that she hasn't made enough milk, that her body was faulty, a bit like with birth. So we internalize that, and we have this mother guilt about, I couldn't breastfeed my baby. We also have this huge amounts of anger that goes along with that, because there is these sort of two camps of how you breastfeed. And for me, breastfeeding is not black or white. There is mostly gray areas. But yes, we mustn't just think about it as food for the infant. Of course, that is highly, highly important. We need to keep that brain functioning with glucose. And I want to give this baby all these immunoglobulins, and I want to feed that gut with exactly the right bacteria that it needs. But I also want that mother to be able to breastfeed and have enough milk.
So this is really important information, though, for women, particularly if they're planning an induction. So they know they're going to be induced for whatever reason, to be able to look out for this and have a plan in place if their baby doesn't, kick in and start doing the whole breastfeeding behaviors, that they've already thought about what they would do. Because sometimes you can't rely on care providers, because let's face it, what should happen doesn't always happen, particularly in hospital settings where there's lots of staff who are overworked. Things get missed. People look and go, that baby's nice and settled, and well, it was at the breast. So I think it's really important for
the birth plan to include the feeding plan and the enchantment hour
Yeah.
plan and the skin to skin. When I'm awake and I'm alert, I want to have skin to skin. I will have skin to skin. And if I'm not able to pick the baby up myself, I want to think about who would help me. If I have to have a cesarean, it's not that easy to move around. Who's going to help you? Absolutely. A breastfeeding plan is essential. And I'm not here trying to push that everyone expresses. I do not want that to happen at all. I literally want it to be physiological. The baby has a magical hour. The midwife is hands off. As a lactation consultant, I don't want to exist, basically. We're there to solve problems. I wish that we weren't, but that's the role of the lactation consultant. It's not to just go in and with all the happy, lovely breastfeeding. We go in when there's issues, when there's problems, these babies are not feeding well.
And realistically, most of the time, most women are having interventions, and lots of those interventions impact on breastfeeding. And I can remember when I was doing private practice when you lived on the coast, and very rarely would you see breastfeeding problems after a physiological home birth. So
yeah, you never wanted to employ me as a private lactation consultant. You never needed me. It was great.
No.
That's how it should be, really.
But that's the reality, is that that's not actually birth for most women and babies. Most women and babies are having interventions. We need to acknowledge that if a woman has had intervention to birth her baby, she may need intervention to get breastfeeding started with her baby. And that care providers, particularly midwives who are working with women closely, need to be watching out for these things. I think often we just, like you say, assume baby's out, it's had a feed, it's all good. And we don't really pay close attention to that mother-baby breastfeeding relationship. And we don't initiate intervention and offer intervention early enough.
Yeah, often. And I think that's definitely the point that we would leave it at. And we can talk about this further in other podcasts of more what the specifics are on this. But again, just so those alarm bells are going off at the back of your head when you see a mother with those who comes onto the ward having had birth, which is traumatic or difficult or induced, or that baby is a late preterm infant. These infants need to be observed more closely. Her breasts probably need a little bit more support if that baby's not feeding well. So definitely these are the main pointers for this, and something that we need to be watching out for. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Midwives Cauldron podcast with me and Rachel. Please subscribe, share us, like us on Instagram, leave us a comment, and whatever else is out there and feasible to do, because quite frankly, who doesn't want a bit of me and Rachel talking about midwifery and womanhood? Because as you will hear, we are incredibly professional when it comes to podcasting and wrapping things up. I'll let you decide. Listen to the mother, hands-on if she's requesting or needing. Let it flow. Fuck off.
Let it flow, let it flow, let it flow.
Isn't that let it snow? Let it flow. What is it? Oh my God, like you could tell we haven't got young children because we don't know what is it? It's not Aladdin. What's the bloody thing? Little Mermaid. Oh.
From Aladdin, that's like let it flow is not bloody.
That's Let It Snow. That's the Christmas song. But Let It Flow is from Adina Mendenzel, you know.
No.
Yeah, anyway. Shut up. What was I saying? I've got to wrap it up, man. You wrap it up. Over the next few episodes, we'll be delving deeper into the rites of passage, perineal bungles, and the hilarious history of wet nursing and breastfeeding. So stay tuned for more episodes with us. And as always, I'll leave you with our final closing bloopers.
During that, I need some kudos, because during that, Floki did the stinkiest shit in his tuck box.
You've been sitting there with a stinky cat shit the whole time.
Yep.
You are a brave woman. I thank you, my friend.